Grace had always thought of her home as a safe haven. But there was one room that made her son, Ethan, freeze in his tracks. It wasn't the cracked tile or the flickering light above the mirror. It wasn't the dripping faucet that had been stubbornly leaking since they moved in. It was something else. Something that crept in quietly, like the steam that curled through the air whenever the water ran. Ethan was 5 the first time Grace noticed it. He stood at the threshold of the bathroom completely still. His tiny feet, planted like he'd grown roots into the floor, eyes wide and fixed on the tiled room ahead. The shower was already running. The warmth spilled into the hallway, but Ethan wouldn't go in. She called his name once, then twice. Nothing. His little hands were clenched into fists. He didn't cry. He didn't whine. He just stared, silent and pale, as if that room held something he couldn't put into words. Something only he could see. Grace stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his back. "It's just a shower, baby," she whispered, forcing a smile. "It's okay." But Ethan shook his head, and he never explained why. At first, she thought, it was a phase. Kids had fears, monsters under the bed, the dark, loud thunder. This felt like one of those. Except it wasn't. Over time, it became a pattern. No matter what she tried, games, toys, rewards, silly songs, he would not enter the bathroom if the water was running. If she forced it, he'd cry uncontrollably. Sometimes, he'd scream. But what haunted her most was the silence, the way he'd shut down, like his body was still present, but his spirit had fled. The pediatrician said he might grow out of it. A child therapist suggested a sensory issue. Grace considered everything. She changed the lighting, replaced the shower head, painted the walls a bright color. Nothing worked. One night, while toweling him off from a bucket bath in the kitchen, Ethan looked up at her and asked quietly, "Mom, is there someone else in our house?" She froze. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Have you ever had a moment where a child said something so strange, so out of place, it made the hairs on your neck stand up? What would you do if your 5-year-old started fearing something that shouldn't exist? Years passed. The fear stayed. By age 8, Ethan still wouldn't go near a running shower. He avoided public pools, gym class, even sleepovers. Grace stopped talking about it to other parents. They didn't understand. Some looked at her with judgment. Others offered advice that sounded more like blame. She started to doubt herself. Was she missing something obvious? Then one night, after he'd had a bad dream, Ethan climbed into her bed and whispered something that chilled her to the core. "Sometimes when I look in the bathroom mirror, I see someone else's face." She sat bolt upright, heart pounding. Still, she told herself it was imagination. Kids saw things, dreamed things, didn't they? But deep down, something didn't sit right. The house had always felt off, especially that room. The bathroom had a strange weight to it, like a space holding its breath. And no matter how warm she made it, it always felt cold. By the time Ethan reached his teens, he'd mastered avoidance. He knew how to pretend things were fine. But Grace still saw the signs, how he'd change the subject if someone mentioned sports camp or the school swim team, how he'd freeze if someone joked about locker room showers. She stopped pressing him, but it haunted her, this invisible thing that had its claws in her son's life. Then, 20 years after that first frozen moment in the hallway, it all began to unravel. It started with a slow drip in the ceiling. Just a minor leak at first. Then came the stains, the swelling drywall, and the black trace of mold. Grace finally called a plumber. His name was Martin. Soft-spoken, experienced, kind. He stepped into the bathroom like it was any other job. But 20 minutes later he tapped on the kitchen wall with urgency in his voice. "Ma'am," he called out, "there's something on this wall. You need to see this." And in that instant, everything Grace thought she knew about her home, her son, and the past, shifted beneath her feet. Because what hid behind that wall would finally explain everything Ethan had feared, and why that fear was never his alone. Stay tuned for next, where the truth begins to claw its way out, and what the plumber found will change everything. Make sure to follow, like, and share. You won't believe what happens next. Grace stood, frozen as Martin, the plumber, beckoned her to the kitchen. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency behind it. "There's something behind the wall," he said, tapping on the plaster with a small, deliberate knock. "It's odd." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She tried to shake off the unease gnawing at her, but the memories, the look in Ethan's eyes all those years, came flooding back. The oddness, the fear that had no explanation, that deep, unsettling sense that something was off in their home. "Behind the wall?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martin nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's more than just plumbing. There's something in there that doesn't belong." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. The last thing she expected was to hear these words. She had heard of hidden rooms before. Old houses often had secrets. But what could possibly be inside the wall of the bathroom? Her hands trembled as she followed Martin's instructions to clear the area. The soft tapping of his hammer against the plaster echoed in the quiet kitchen, each strike sending a small tremor through her body. The minutes dragged on, each one thicker with tension. When the drywall finally cracked and fell away, Grace was hit with a musty, damp smell. It wasn't surprising. This was an old house, but as Martin pulled the remaining pieces away, revealing the hollow space behind the wall, Grace could feel something shift in the air. What was that sound? She thought. She heard something moving inside, a whisper, a rustle, and then her eyes widened. Behind the wall, wedged between pipes and exposed wood beams, there was something she hadn't expected to find. It wasn't an object or a piece of forgotten furniture. It was a set of old photographs, wrapped in a yellowing cloth. They were crumpled and worn, but still recognizable. And as she stepped closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The face in the photograph was unmistakable. It was Ethan, but it was a much younger version of him. In fact, it was him as a child, barely 5 years old, standing in front of that very same bathroom mirror. Grace could hardly breathe as she stared at the image. How was this possible? These were photos she had never seen before. Her heart hammered in her chest, and panic slowly crept in. She reached out to touch the photo, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. The image seemed to flicker in her mind, as if it had a memory of its own. "Martin," she gasped, voice breaking. "What is this?" Martin looked as shaken as she was. His hand paused above the photographs, his face pale. I don't know, but it doesn't make sense. This house has been here for decades. And these photos, they weren't here before." Grace's mind raced. Who would have placed these here? How had they been hidden for so long? Was this the reason Ethan had been so afraid of the bathroom? Was this somehow tied to the fear that had haunted him his entire life? With trembling hands, Grace lifted the photos from the wall and carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside, there were not just photographs but old letters, yellowed, brittle with age. She could barely make out the faint ink, but one word stood out in bold, sharp handwriting. "Remember, remember." She turned the letter over, scanning it quickly. There was something about this letter, something urgent, something that felt as though it had been written for her, like it was calling her to understand something hidden in her past. Was it related to the house? To Ethan? Her thoughts began to swirl, the pieces of the puzzle she'd never known she was solving suddenly, starting to come together. What do you think Grace will find next? Is this part of Ethan's past, or something darker? Stay tuned, follow, like, and share. This mystery is just beginning. Grace stood there, heart pounding, as she carefully unwrapped the letter from the cloth. The words seemed to blur in front of her eyes. But there was no mistaking the urgency in the faded ink. She ran her finger over the word, remember, feeling the weight of it sink into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no accident, no forgotten relic of the house. These photos, this letter, were connected to Ethan. They were connected to the fear he'd carried for years, the kind of fear that could never be explained. But why? Her fingers trembled as she continued to study the letter. The handwriting was old, definitely from another time, yet somehow it felt all too familiar. There was something chilling about it, a familiarity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Ethan had always been an odd, quiet child, but now Grace began to wonder if this fear had something to do with more than just his imagination. The photos didn't lie. Ethan had been in this bathroom as a child, and somehow no one had noticed. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that had been buried for decades. Martin, standing next to her, looked at the photographs with a mixture of disbelief and unease. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace felt an uneasiness settle in her stomach. She needed answers, and not just about what had been hidden in the wall, but about her son's past. She had always believed that Ethan's fear of the bathroom was something he'd outgrown. But this changed everything. "Martin," she said, trying to steady her voice, "can you find out where these photos came from? Do you know anyone who could help?" Martin nodded slowly, his face pale. "I'll see what I can do, but I don't think we're just dealing with plumbing problems anymore." As Grace carefully placed the photos and the letter into a box, her mind raced. How could she have missed something so significant? She thought about the years of worry, the years of wondering if there was something more to Ethan's fear. But now, she was beginning to believe the answers lay not just in her home, but in its hidden past. That night, as the house grew quieter, Grace lay awake in bed, the photos still on her mind. The letter kept repeating in her head. Remember. What was she supposed to remember, and why had this been hidden for so long? She turned the box over in her hands, scanning every detail. As her fingers brushed over the crinkled paper, she noticed something. One corner of the letter was folded in an odd way, as if it had been hidden within the folds of the paper intentionally. Her curiosity piqued. She unfolded it carefully. On the back of the letter, there was more writing. It was scrawled hastily, almost as though the writer had been in a rush. The words seemed to get darker, more desperate with each line. "The bathroom is cursed. Don't let him see what's behind the mirror. If he does, you'll never be able to..." "Stop it!" Grace's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't even dared to imagine it. The bathroom was cursed? What did that mean? And what did it have to do with Ethan? The air in the room seemed to grow colder as she thought about the mirror. The one Ethan had always avoided, the one where he claimed to see another face. The bathroom mirror. Was it true? Was there something in that bathroom that they hadn't seen? Something that had haunted Ethan all this time, and most chilling of all, what was it that Ethan hadn't been able to remember? Something hidden, something dark that had been kept from him for his entire life? Grace's thoughts raced, but there was one thing she knew for sure. She had to get to the bottom of this. She couldn't ignore the signs anymore. She had to uncover the truth, not just for herself, but for Ethan. Whatever was in that bathroom, whatever secret it held, could not stay buried any longer. The next day, she called a local historian who specialized in the history of old houses. She needed answers. She had to know if anyone had ever experienced anything unusual in the house. Something connected to the bathroom. the strange feeling she had every time she walked in, the chills that ran down her spine. Was it just her imagination, or was it real? As she awaited the historian's response, Grace couldn't shake the image of the bathroom mirror from her mind. She had to see it for herself. What was behind it? You're right. I missed the call to action at the end. Here's how the final section should look, with the call to action added. The morning light filtered through the curtains as Grace paced the hallway, her mind racing with the information she'd uncovered. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the phone in her hand, awaiting the call from the historian. Every part of her screamed to hurry, to find the truth before the darkness of the past could swallow her whole. She couldn't ignore the feeling anymore, the feeling that something sinister lurked just beneath the surface of the ordinary, and the bathroom mirror was the key to it all. Finally, her phone rang. "Hello?" Grace answered, her voice tight. "Grace, it's Claire, the historian. I've done some research on your house. You're right, there's something unusual about it. Something disturbing," Claire said, her voice strained. "But what I've found is even darker than I thought." Grace's heart raced as she sat down on the edge of the couch. "What do you mean?" The house was built in the 1920s, and the original owners were very secretive. There were rumors that something terrible happened in the bathroom, something that was covered up, but there's no record of it. The only clue I could find was that one of the previous owners, a woman named Margaret Walker, had been obsessed with mirrors. Grace's stomach dropped. Margaret Walker. That name, she recognized it. Ethan had said something about a woman's face he saw in the mirror, a woman who wasn't there. Could it be the same person? Margaret was reportedly seen staring into mirrors for hours, as if she was looking for something. But her obsession with them turned dark. People started talking about strange happenings around the house. Whispers of the curse began to spread, and Margaret became more and more isolated. They say she believed the mirrors could reveal another world, a world that wasn't meant to be seen. Grace felt her blood run cold. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they didn't make any sense. A curse? A woman who thought mirrors could show something beyond reality? "Claire," Grace said, her voice trembling. "What happened to her?" Margaret vanished in the early 1930s. No one knows what happened to her, but there were rumors that she died in the house, in that very bathroom. People believe her spirit is still trapped there, lurking behind the mirrors. Grace swallowed hard. A ghost? A curse? It sounded like something out of a nightmare. But now, knowing what she had uncovered, it made sense. Ethan's fear of the bathroom, the feeling of being watched, the strange image he'd seen in the mirror. Could it be true? Was it Margaret Walker's spirit that had haunted him all these years? "I'm coming over," Grace said, determined. "I need to see it for myself." When Grace arrived at the house, she felt a wave of unease wash over her. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She walked to the bathroom, her hand trembling as she touched the door handle. Ethan had never been able to enter this room without hesitation, without a shudder. Now, Grace could feel that same cold chill in the air. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the mirror. It was just as Ethan had described it, a large, antique mirror with a tarnished frame. The kind of mirror that looked like it had been there for decades. The kind of mirror that seemed to hold more than just a reflection. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stood there staring at her reflection, and for a split second, she thought she saw something, someone, in the mirror behind her. But when she turned, the room was empty. No one was there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the mirror. Was this it? Was this the cursed mirror? And if it was, what did it hide? What had it shown Ethan all these years? Grace reached out, her fingers brushing the glass. It was cold, colder than it should have been. And then for just a moment she swore she saw it. A faint, fleeting image in the reflection. A woman, pale, eyes wide with fear. She gasped, stumbling back. Was it Margaret Walker? Was this the spirit her son had seen? Suddenly there was a loud crack and the mirror shattered. The pieces fell to the floor in a cascade of broken glass, and for a moment everything was silent. The room felt lighter. The oppressive air that had settled in the bathroom seemed to dissipate. Grace stood frozen, staring at the shards scattered on the floor. Among them, there was something that hadn't been there before. It was a small, faded key. She bent down to pick it up, her hands shaking as she held it in front of her. What was it for? And why had it been hidden in the mirror? The truth was out there. The curse had been broken, but only by uncovering what had been hidden for so long. And now, Grace had one final piece of the puzzle. The key. The key to Ethan's past. The key to unlocking the secrets of the house. But what would it open? What do you think the key unlocks? What hidden truth is still waiting to be discovered? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like, follow and share for more untold stories. Now the call to action is in place. Let me know if you'd like to adjust anything further